All right, let me just get rid of that. My paper is long, so I'm going to just highlight the main parts and try as much as I can to be responsive to what's already been said at this conference. I've oriented I've oriented my remarks towards the project of a naturalized social metaphysics, which I understand as a metaphysics built not on philosophical a prioris, but on the best science available. Regarding the most fundamental reality, there's no question. The best science is some form of quantum field theory building on general relativity and quantum mechanics. When it comes to the social sciences, we have instead chaos. On the right, you see depicted the major figures associated with some of the competing paradigms in the social sciences. Marx, you likely recognize, maybe Foucault, the bald guy with the glasses, who represents post-structuralism. The other bald guy is Peter Berger, representing constructionism. The guy with the pipe is Herbert Blumer, representing symbolic interactionism, and the guy with the hands is Pierre Bourdieu. One woman is Anne Swidler, known for practice theory, and the rightmost figure at the top is Auguste Comte, considered a father of sociology, which he envisioned as a social physics, and who gave us the word positivism, connoting the attempt to build just that. Positivist empiricism does what Ron suggested social science, standard social sciences do yesterday, that is collect and analyze data. And the positivist empiricists don't really have much time for or concern for metaphysical considerations. It's actually the default inheritance of the social sciences or the received view, especially in economics. Even in economics, though, it's challenged as it is more so in other disciplines. If, as I understand it, a naturalized social ontology is to build on social science, then philosophers need to know the social scientific lay of the land. Providing that landscape is one major objective of my paper. But as I go along, I'm also going to make a number of specific arguments. First, in my written paper, set out to defend the reality of social scientific constructs against everything must go. But Don graciously gave me some comments suggesting I may have misinterpreted James Ladyman in his denial that social things exist. But they also seem to oppose what they call a container view of the universe, which after hearing Catherine and Oliver's paper, I began to interpret as perhaps a foundational claim, but then Don denies, doesn't seem to believe in foundationalism. So I'm hoping to get some clarity from him on that. At the end, I'm going to defend what I think is the broadest ontology in social science, which is called SAC, for structure, agency, and culture. Social structure has long been slighted by philosophy, although Sally Haslanger and some others, and now Harold, have now drawn attention to it. I'm also going to defend a non-foundationalist epistemology, much like what Harold suggests, which implies that even for conceptual debate in philosophy, there's no a priori method for problem resolution, which I also say must be handled on a case-by-case basis. It follows from such non-foundationalism, or so I will argue, that we cannot rid ourselves completely either from a priori or folk intuitions or folk arguments. So there are many different competing paradigms in the social sciences. One way to make sense of them is via the distinction Dilthey made between the Geisteswissenschaften and Naturwissenschaften. The positivist empiricists endorse a unity of science around the so-called Humean covering law model of causality. The interpretivists accept that model is applicable only to the natural sphere. They think it's applicable to, it's applicable to the natural sphere only, and think, as I think you all know, that the human sphere is to be explained only by reasons rather than causes. The post-structuralists talk more in terms of discourses, but similarly, they don't think in terms of causes. The critical realists who I represent reject the covering law model in favor of a powers view of causality, which we think includes reasons too, and so we reject the divide between the human and natural sciences. We almost believe in the unity of science along non-positivist lines. Here you see the covering law model alongside the two Carls, Popper and Hempel, with whom we in the social sciences associate the model. One effect of the covering law model is to make mathematical equations the paradigm of causal explanation. In effect, and this is important, the covering law model sucks the causal agency out of the things of the world and relocates it instead in the causal laws. As I say, the critical realists reject the covering law model of causal explanation. As one of my objectives is to show how metaphysical views get debated in the social sciences, let me say something about our attack on it. In the middle, you see Roy Bhaskar, one of the iconic figures of critical realism. In his realist theory of science, he makes what he calls a Kantian transcendental argument concerning what the world must be like to make successful science possible. Part of that argument revolves around the distinction between the closed causal system found in a laboratory, where only one or a few causal mechanisms operate, and the open system of the outside world, where many changing causal mechanisms operate simultaneously. Bhaskar argues that law-like event regularities can be found only in closed causal systems like laboratories. If Bhaskar makes a transcendental argument, the heterodox economist Tony Lawson and I both make more of an empirical argument that no regularities have been found or will be found with the requisite invariance to allow the constituent deductions of the covering law model. As I say in the paper for this conference, drawing on the distinction made by philosophers Ehrman and Roberts, all such regularities will be seen to rely on ceteris paribus clauses that are non-lazy. That is, can't in principle be completed. With the abandonment of the covering model, the critical realists at least think instead in terms of causal powers and causal mechanisms. But causal powers are the powers of things. So if causal powers exist, then by the Eleatic principle, so much things, including the higher level things that social scientists study. As I say, Don says that he and Ladyman don't deny that social things exist, but I would like to hear more about how that's compatible with a non-container view of the universe. With the causal power views, as Nancy Cartwright observes, causality becomes a thicker concept, not all just homogeneous if-then relations. So pushing becomes different from pulling, and both are different from commanding. The powers conception of causality also removes the mystery from emergence. In the first place, elementary particles, or whatever is down there, are no longer considered governed by inviolable laws that determine everything else, but by causal powers that can be counteracted by causal powers of other things, either at the same level or at levels above. Second, the powers view of causality allows a distinction unavailable to the Humean view, a distinction between the constitution and exercise of a causal power. With that distinction, it can be allowed that a new causal power is constituted without mystery by lower level things than their causal powers. But once new causal powers emerge among a new level of wholes, interactions among those wholes take on new causal logics not found at lower levels. Think of the role played by geometry and chemistry, such as the lock and key mechanism in enzymatic reactions, which doesn't have a causal analog at the atomic or subatomic levels. So I've so far called attention to different forms of argument in the social sciences against the covering law model, and argued that with the powers view of causality, we recover thinghood, or the bearers of those powers, and also different ontological levels characterized by those powers. If I understand him correctly, Don resists any conception of levels, so that still continues to be a difference between us. But I want to turn now to other metaphysical issues in the social sciences. We're living now in a post-truth era where, in Foucauldian terms, a worldwide right-wing populism challenges the current regimes of truth erected by knowledge workers, be they scientists, journalists, diplomats, or generals. But if you remember the science wars of the 1990s, before there was our current right-wing assault on conventional regimes of truth, there was a left-wing assault, which depicted the very notion of truth as an implement of power. The science wars originated in what Alston calls an epistemic conception of truth. Alston distinguished two conceptions of truth depending on what is considered the truth maker. Depicted on the left is, or on the right, is what Alston calls the alethic or ontological conception of truth, which is essentially some form of the correspondence theory. The truth maker is not our level of agreement or certainty, nor our methodology, but the actual world. If the world that is ontologically independent of us is as we say or think it is, we're in possession of the truth, however uncertain or how we arrived at it. However, whatever our level of uncertainty or how we arrived at it. The alternative to the ontological conception of truth is an epistemic conception that equates truth with an epistemic state like certainty, or like the pragmatists with consensus, or like the positivists with the results of certain epistemic measures or protocols. This epistemic view of truth is actually shared by the social constructionists and post-structuralists. Post-structuralism being just a linguistic version of constructionism. And I should say that when I talk about constructionism, I'm talking about what Ian Hacking calls the global constructionists, rather than people who are locally constructionists who would say, as people have said here, and which I agree, that race or gender are socially constructed. The global social constructionists think that that's all there is social constructions. The view of the positivist empiricists is that truth emerges axiomatically from the results of properly conducted research, yielding certainty or consensus. The global social constructionists, on the other hand, particularly those in the social studies of science like Harry Collins, reveal that this positivist confidence is naive. The social constructionists demonstrate that even the results of properly done experiments are subject to what they call rhetorical negotiation. In Changing Order, for example, Collins explores the scientific dismissal of early experimental support for gravity waves on the conceptual grounds that the findings were levels of magnitude too large. The global constructionists conclude that if foundationalism breaks down, then as Kant maintained, we cannot get at reality as it is in itself. Instead, we create and challenge our realities through our rhetoric of practices. In her very popular book, The Body Multiple, Anne-Marie Moll argues that if we foreground practices, then ontology becomes multiple, with something like atherosclerosis becoming ontologically different for different medical practitioners. More generally, as in the claim that atherosclerosis is not one thing but many, the post-structuralists enjoy overturning folk understandings of things. The understanding of rhetoric upheld by the constructionists and post-structuralists is that of the sophists like Protagoras on the right, who believe that reality is a rhetorical construction. In contrast with the positivists and the constructionists, the critical realists opt for Alston's ontological conception of truth, with the world as such, the truth maker. How do we access the world when locked within our own conceptual categories, or what Frederick Jameson called the prison house of language? The critical realists agree with the constructionists that truth does not emerge axiomatically from any a priori foundational methodology. Instead, like Feyerabend, critical realists believe in a methodological anarchy, according to which multiple different methods might apply to any particular issue. Even though the critical realists concede, we're always still left with rhetoric. For the critical realists, however, it is the rhetoric of Aristotle rather than Pythagoras, meaning that for the critical realists, rhetoric does not create the truth, but instead merely identifies it in contexts where formal proofs are unavailable. What makes the critical realists different from the constructionists is not just the ontological conception of truth the critical realists adopt, but also their belief in judgmental rationality. That is, an ability on a case-by-case basis to find some arguments better than others. According to the critical realists, our best guess about the truth of a matter is what we judge to be the best argument so far. That judgment is always fallible and could be wrong. More important, it's a judgment that requires canvassing the whole range of arguments arrayed around any question, including the arguments on behalf of folk wisdom. How, for example, can we judge Emery Moll's position in atherosclerosis without examining the argument against it on behalf of the common sense view? Thus, in short, the critical realists hold that knowledge is non-foundational, with folk ideas or arguments never eliminable. So for the last part of my talk, I want to introduce and defend one of the broadest ontologies on offer in the social sciences, again defended by the critical realists, called SAC, stands for structure, agency, and culture as three distinct categories of social being. Philosophers are very familiar with culture, which essentially includes anything with shared or shareable meaning. Since meaning resides in our heads, things like rules exist only if humans share some consciousness of them. In old Marxian terms, culture relates to the ideationalist or idealist dimension of social being. I actually don't know anyone in the social sciences who's a methodological individualist in the philosophical sense. Almost all social scientists understand that humans dwell within collective cultures. If they're individuals, they tend to be structural individuals, not understanding structure. There's actually more controversy in the social sciences about agency and what it means. The critical realists follow Donald Davidson in understanding agency as behavior that is intentional under some description, with motives and intentions understood as mental states attributable to individual actors. Outside of the critical realists, Donald Davidson's piece on agency is generally unknown among social scientists. Instead, social scientists naively draw on a largely folk understanding of agency as involving a conscious plan of action or a mental picture of the action's goal. The main image of conscious agency that results is this of a player behind a chessboard. Since most of our behavior is not so discursively worked out, a good many social scientists, especially sociologists, assume that most of our behavior is unconscious. As Tony Giddens argues, most of our behavior is routine and not directly motivated. The pragmatists similarly stress unconscious habit. And for practice theorists, post-structurists and post-Wittgensteinians, individual agency gets swallowed up by cultural rules or cultural discourses. The chess player understanding of conscious agency is subject to compelling counterexamples. We generally speak without prior planning or picturing in our minds what we're going to say, but we wouldn't say that we speak unconsciously. A full counter to the chess player understanding would rely on ordinary language philosophy to show how intentionality actually functions. Ordinary language philosophy being yet another tool I think is important for ontological debate. If there's one thing that folk wisdom gets right, it is that human action is motivated and goal-directed. And we can see again clearly the ineluctability of folk understanding in the social sciences by examining one prominent effort to dismiss it. In his classic work, Suicide, Emil Durkheim, one of the very founders of sociology, explicitly rejects the folk understanding of suicide as intentional self-homicide. He substitutes the definition of suicide, as any act that victims know might lead to their deaths. The problem with this effort is that Durkheim is no longer examining what anyone means by suicide, but rather a melange of behaviors that amount to something quite different, which might better be called Durkicide. Fortunately for Durkheim, he makes a mistake in operationalization that saves his project from utter irrelevance. To make his case, he draws on official statistics, which employ not Durkheim's definition of suicide, but the common sense definition employed by the folk. The point here is that social scientists are typically trying to explain things that common folk worry about in their own terms. To maintain that relevance, there must be at least some continuity between folk and social scientific definitions. So the last thing I want to address is social structure, which, as I say, philosophers have until recently overlooked, and I'm glad to see Harold mention it. Going back to Robert Merton, social structure is a venerable concept in the social sciences, but it remains contested. In the passage you see from Merton, structure was traditionally distinguished from culture. Whereas culture, as I said, is ideational, something residing in the collective heads of actors. Structure was traditionally conceived as something more material or ontologically independent of collective consciousness. That's to say that structure, as in Merton's words, was understood as a set of relations, like an unequal distribution of opportunities, that could exist whether or not anyone were conscious of it. The opposition between culture and structure came to a head in 1965 after the release of Daniel Patrick Moynihan's The Negro Family, which blamed continued poverty among African Americans on an ideational culture of poverty instead of continued material inequality of opportunity. More recently, the more material understanding of structure has been displaced by an understanding of social structure as something more cultural. Anthony Giddens defines structure as rules and resources, while William Sewell added to that list of cultural schemas. On this understanding, structure is understood as something that structures. And indeed, cultural rules and schemas do structure human behavior. So there's nothing wrong with understanding structure this way, I would say, except when it completely displaces the original understanding of structure, since doing so essentially resolves the culture of poverty debate by definition. Structure disappears as a distinct category from culture. So I have to say, I've been on the forefront of defending the more material understanding of social structure as relations that, however emergent from cultural rules, constitutive rules, whatever you call them, I know this is now a debate among you. However emergent from culture, these social structural relations exist and exist consequentially regardless of anyone's notice. How do I make that argument? Ostensibly, by drawing attention to, among other things, relations of power, to situations of limited good or zero-sum conditions, and unequal playing fields, and arguing that these relations can exist apart from notice. There's been pushback from this position from people like Ram Hare, who argued that only particulars and not relations can possess causal powers, and also from others who are likewise more nominalist about relations. So this issue is still under contention. I would like to speak more about it, but instead I'm going to wrap up. If I correctly understand what is meant by naturalized metaphysics, it's one rooted in the best science, and how it gets argued. Naturalized social metaphysics then needs to decide what the best social science is and how it gets argued. One point I've been making is that philosophers can only know that by familiarizing themselves with it and the social scientific debates. Along the way, I have rehearsed arguments against an understanding of causality based on human regularities and in favor of causal powers and mechanisms view. I'm still unsure where Don and Ladyman stand on real causality in the universe, but if we accept it, then I argued on the powers view, ontological levels and emergence return. I argued too that knowledge accumulation is non-foundational and based provisionally in the best argument so far, which meant for me that all arguments must be canvassed, including those emanating from the folk. And finally, I sought to defend what I call the broadest social ontology on offer, which includes structure, agency, and culture as three distinct categories. I thank you for your attention, and again, for inviting me here.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, really nice.
Thank you.
So, questions? Okay, Francesco.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have a question concerning the role of causal powers in your view. So I would like to know more about what you think, what is your metaphysical view of causal powers, because in the literature, there are very specific entities. Usually they have their properties intrinsically and essentially. So I was wondering how to apply this notion to the social realm, if it's the same notion of causal powers you're talking about, or if it's something more like dispositions, which is different.
There may be subtle differences between those positions that you philosophers make. I would say, yeah, it's somewhere between dispositional, and I have read some debates among you. I'm trying to remember who I read recently on this, Um, I think that the powers are intrinsic. I'd be tempted to say that I understand them as intrinsic. They're intrinsic depending on how they were constituted. So a principal of a school intrinsically has the power to expel students. The principal gets that from, I'm going to call them the constitutive rules. I know the other Francesco has some disputes about constitutive rules, but I'm going to still stick with that terminology for the moment. Does that, so I would say that it is an intrinsic property of a principle.
Yeah, so in that case, it wouldn't seem to me intrinsic, because the power of the principle to do something, it seems something that it's being conferred to him or to her by someone else. So in this sense, they would be intrinsic properties of the principle. And I mean, I agree that there is some causal relevance in the social realm. I'm just worried about this use of causal powers, where in the literature they're usually at a more fundamental level. I mean, and that again doesn't rule out the fact that there is such a thing as causality, or at least causal relevance in the social realm. It's just that it doesn't seem intrinsic to me. It seems problematic to think of these properties that are intrinsic to the social actors.
I suppose, can you, what does it mean to be intrinsic?
That's tough to but to define. But I would say that something has an intrinsic property, regardless of, if and only if there's no change outside of it that determines the property. Now, again, it's so it's tough to define it in metaphysics too, but that's the gist of it. Yeah.
Is it like it has this property in all possible worlds?
Not necessarily, but it doesn't have to be in all possible. I guess no, it doesn't have to be in all possible worlds, but it has independently of what happens around it. So, and of course, in the social world, that's not the case.
So
Yeah.
I think my best answer to you then is, I'm not sure. I defer to the philosophy more than my colleagues. So when you guys figure out what intrinsic means, I'll be happy to decide whether I think it's intrinsic or not.
Yeah.
Okay. So, nice discussion. What do we move on to Jonathan, who has a question?
I think
Yeah,
I'm next.
hi.
I think I'm next, but anyway.
Oh, John, you can
No,
go, why don't you go ahead? I'll go after you. Oh, that's all good.
Go
Should I
ahead.
go?
Go ahead.
Sorry, well, it makes, Jonathan, it makes a bit more sense because I want to stay on the same thing that Francesco was just on. So sorry to pull priority order, but I was, yeah. Anyway,
Fine with me.
causal powers. Yeah, I don't see, Doug, that you need this concept, right? I mean, causation is tremendously important in all the sciences. I mean, that's what most of the sciences are mostly trying to do, is identify causal relationships. I mean, that's not exclusively what they do, but it's the lion's share of the work. And certainly it's true in social science. I don't understand what to me, causal powers, intrinsic causal powers associated with objects, or indeed with anything, that seems to be an occult idea, if I ever heard one. You asked in your talk, what do Ladyman and I think about causation? I mean, what we say in the book is, well, certain kinds of relationships that are understood as causal are crucial in all the special sciences. Whether causation has any metaphysical interpretation is for us strictly to be settled by the issues in philosophy of physics over whether we need to understand universal physical processes in terms of whether we find an analog to causation playing a role in our best universal physics in quantum theory and relativity. And that's a live issue in philosophy of physics. So philosophers of physics who are well informed about the physics disagree on that. I think our side is slightly in the majority, but I mean, it's, you know, I haven't done a poll. But regardless of that, I mean, and the only reason we privilege physics is not because we think it's foundational. I don't believe in foundations either. It's just that, but physics is the parts of physics are the only part of science that make a claim to universal applicability at all scales in space and throughout the universe. And so, so insofar as one understands metaphysics as being an attempt to say how everything hangs together, physics plays a special role. I think, and so physics tells us things that are metaphysically relevant, I think, in ways that other sciences don't, but we're not skeptics. So yes, there's causation. Yes, there are objects. We're just rejecting, in the long tradition of pragmatists, of Peirce and Dewey and Rorty, we're just denying that all this intrinsicality, fundamentality, that any of that amounts to anything more than the overextension of some practical metaphors that people use in their everyday interactions with the world.
Yeah. So Doug, do you want to respond?
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually am willing to concede to you. It's beyond my expertise, but I'm willing to concede that at the most fundamental level, the relationships among what we take to be particles is not causal. You seem to suggest something like that. I'm happy to concede that. I think that you don't accept as well emergence, because I would say thinghood is something that emerges from these lower levels, whereas you seem to want to say that the Schrodinger equation, that there's some wave equation of the universe, and that's really when that would be the some explanation of everything. If I have you right.
I think look, the only thing, again, we're not denying that we track objects. That's what people do, and that's what scientists must do as well. What we deny is that we should understand these objects metaphysically as individuals, again, in the special metaphysician sense. And in particular, because we don't find, I mean, what we're denying there is atomism. And it seems to us atomism doesn't apply in universal physics. And if it doesn't apply in physics, it's quite mysterious that it applies. It would be very surprising if it's a good metaphysic in general. I'm more comfortable thinking of objects as just slow moving processes, because it seems to me our best evidence is reality is dynamic. That's just, I mean, it's motion. So, but that is itself just more metaphor mongering. So, I mean, I certainly don't want to say that I think it's metaphysically true that objects are slow moving processes. I just find that a more helpful way to think. And because it doesn't involve, therefore, using a different metaphor in physics than elsewhere. So it's got some virtues of concision.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I have to digest what you're saying.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. While you're doing that, Jonathan has a question.
Oh, yeah. Hey, so this is about the SAC ontology for this that you were proposing. And I liked the way that you were wanting to be more materialist about structures. I was just wondering if you had enough material stuff overall in your ontology. And in particular, I was wondering what, if any, place the material resources in the environment have
Oh.
in your ontology, the bridges, buildings, and bathrooms that I think are part of the social world. They're not structures understood as just relations between individuals, even if those are material relations between individuals. They're not agency, they're not culture, they're not ideational, they're physical structures, they're physical resources, excuse me. Where do they live?
Well, you're right. I think they have to, and there's been some criticism of the SAC. I think they have to be included as well. I certainly have no, I don't know anybody who in the social sciences who would exclude them. Actor network theory has tried to include them more explicitly in a way that I have trouble with, but I certainly agree with their inclusion. So I definitely think they should be included.
Are we okay to go to the CARS model that has an R in it? Or SARC? I like CARS better.
Well, by rights, yes. I don't know. Yes. Yes.
Okay, so we still have some time and no other questions. Anything, Doug, you'd like to expand on a bit?
Well, I guess I'd like to go back with Don. So I know you don't believe in foundations, but it seems to me in the scheme that Catherine and Oliver made between descriptive and I don't know what they said, what they called it, the other one.
Foundational.
Yeah. Ontology. So in some sense, you are saying, on the one hand, it sounds like you're saying, yes, it's fine for social scientists and the folk to go on treating reality as if there were things with causation, because that's what we have to do to get by in the world. Although I don't know what you mean by us now, but as a center of consciousness, but leave that aside. But you seem to be saying it's okay for us to continue doing that, but it is a misrecognition, or what it sounded like Catherine and Oliver were saying, a deceptive appearance.
No. So I'm increasingly finding that the easiest way to sort of frame what we're doing when we have to be fairly concise about it and can't go on and on is to do it in the way philosophers traditionally do, by referring ourselves back to antecedent ideas in the history of philosophy. And if I do it that way, I mean, it's not how we do it in the book, but we have done it here and there in some papers. But if I do it that way, the great philosopher we're closest to by far is Peirce. And now, so let's talk about the pragmatist tradition. One of the key defining features of pragmatism is denial of foundationalism, full stop. Sometimes most of the pragmatists, many of the pragmatists, this is certainly true of Dewey and Rorty, many of the pragmatists simply denounce metaphysics in general. That is, they argue that metaphysics is just a misbegotten enterprise. Peirce doesn't go there, and neither do we, and we don't go there for reasons which we think are an update of, well, Peirce's views updated by the fact that we've got quantum theory. We can see a relatively mature quantum physics, and Peirce didn't have that. It's nothing to do with one thing that's also, no pragmatist denies and wants to push an appearance reality distinction. That's again crucial to pragmatism, right? I mean, so here for us, if if there is room for metaphysics, if there is anything for metaphysicians to do at all, it's say something, if there is something to be said, about how the whole of reality can hang together in one picture. We have no argument that that is possible. So the dappled, we'd have no knockdown argument against dappled world stories of the Cartwright-Dupre sort. But we just find it odd. I mean, it's very strange to say reality is multiple, literally. I mean, that is as if it's a bunch of islands that are unconnected. I mean, that seems to be the metaphor that Dupre and Cartwright have in mind, and I don't get it. So, and then we also note that there's an actual asymmetry in scientific practice, that physicists, that special scientists are not allowed to contradict current generalizations of physics. But there's no asymmetric issue. Physicists don't have to pay attention to sociologists, or for that matter, chemists. So there really is there's a working asymmetry in the relations among the scientists. We don't think it's foundational because we don't see any evidence in the structure of the sciences that it's foundational. What then does one do with all of those pieces now laid out on the table? What we try to do is we say, well, what else besides physical theory itself has universal applicability? Well, math. And then there's also statistics, which does not have universal applicability because it's for reasons I won't go into now. But then, and statistics is tremendously important in the special sciences. That's what special sciences track mostly and model. So what falls all out of all of that is, if there is a general story to be told about reality in general, we doubt that it can be expressed in natural language. I mean, we think, for example, the reason Dewey and Rorty deny metaphysics altogether is because they don't quite grasp that there's the linguistic apprehension is the only way to apprehend or represent reality. There's also the engaging with reality through math is different than doing it through language. And we think there's a potential story to be told that can help us distinguish between the parts of mathematics that don't have empirical application and the parts that do. And to the extent we can distinguish the parts of mathematics that have empirical application, we can then look for general structures in that mathematics that can be associated with a universal ontology. And then one can, and that potentially is interesting for special sciences, because the way in which physics might restrict or constrain special sciences is not in a sense of reduction of foundations, but physics has something to say about propagation of influence in systems and about information flow, and potentially therefore restricts the statistics. And so we expect that to the extent one can apply those mathematical ideas to the systems that are studied in special sciences, we can discover surprising ontological commonalities that would not at all be evident. Now, there's your appearance reality, if you like, coming back, except it's not a metaphysical distinction between appearance and reality. It's just humans don't track their everyday world in terms of deep mathematics. We track it in terms of objects and events and the usual stuff. So, I mean, one of our little slogans is, you shouldn't expect to be able to do metaphysics in natural language. It's going to need to be done in mathematics, if it's doable at all. And we're proposing a possible program. We're not asserting we know that it's doable. So maybe, I don't know, does that enough? Did that help?
Well, it helps. I would need more time with you than we have here, but it helps.
Yes, yes. Okay, Raphael, we don't have any more questions. What do you suggest?
So yes, and Paul Roth is not here. So wait, I will just turn on that.
Oh,
Host has disabled participant screen sharing. I think I need to be given co-host status. Okay, is it done? All right, let's try it again. All right, here it is. And I will put it on this. Okay, can everyone see my screen? It's all okay. Harold, can you see it?
We can see it, but it's quite small.
Oh, it's small.
I see it and it's not small.
Is
It's
it
not
taking up the
small.
whole? It's
It's
taking
not
up the
small.
whole
Yeah,
screen.
it's in full screen mode for me.
Okay, I
Okay.
think then you need to set it into full screen mode. Okay, excellent. Okay, so this is, I don't know what to make of this, this talk. I mean, in some ways, I think it's very superficial, and but it's how I think about things, and so maybe I'm just superficial, and I welcome anyone's input. Okay, so let me, why is it not, there it goes. Okay, so here's my outline. I'm going to start with some questions, and then I'm going to ask what is the methodology of social theory and what is the methodology of social ontology, so that I can attempt to compare them. And then I'm going to describe one form of pragmatism where I think they come together. And then I'm going to give an example. It's going to be my work in practice theory, and I'm going to draw a conclusion. Okay, so Raphael gave us some prompts, and first of that, well, he had many of them, but I'm going to look at two of them. First is, what is the relation between social ontology and the social sciences? Should social ontology be naturalized? If yes, how should this naturalization be conceived? Are descriptive social ontology and descriptive natural ontology methodologically identical? And can social ontology be revisionist? If yes, what is the relation between descriptive and revisionist social ontologies? So I'm going to consider, what do we mean by the social sciences in this? So what is the relation social ontology and social sciences? What are the social sciences? What is the methodology of the social sciences? What comparison is being asked for? And what is the methodology of social ontology, and what would it mean to naturalize it? So that's mostly what I'm going to talk about, though along the way, I will say something about descriptive versus revisionist ontology. Okay, so here's a quote about what social theory is. And Austin Harrington says, social theory refers to ideas, arguments, hypotheses, thought experiments, and explanatory speculations about how and why human societies, or elements or structures of societies, come to be formed, change, develop over time, or disappear. But many common understandings of the scope of the field also imply a wider range of reference than this. Social theory can also be thought of as incorporating normative concerns bearing on debates about desirable ends or values of social life, about how social life ideally ought to be, in ways that overlap closely with concerns in the fields of moral, political, and legal philosophy. So the difference between social science and social theory was brought to my attention in those words by Charles Parsons, who's a professor of philosophy at Harvard, who's the son of Talcott Parsons. And I gave a talk there, and he came up, and I think I said something about social science, and he says, "You don't mean social science, really. You mean social theory, don't you?" And I was thinking, whoa, I'm not sure I'm quite clear on the difference, but I do mean social theory. And here's Talcott Parsons, who himself was someone who did social theory. He says, "There will be no attempt to avoid philosophical issues on the plea that they are philosophical or metaphysical and hence have no place in a scientific study. This is often a facile way of evading the clear decision of vital but embarrassing issues." All right, so I'm going to talk about social theory in the grand tradition of Parsons and others, and here are many others. This is just because I'm not sure that philosophers are as familiar with all of the social theorists, because some of them don't make their living being philosophers, but they've all been very influential to me, and many, many more, I should say. It's a very interdisciplinary group of people. So social theory, critical theory. What is critical theory? Here's a extended quote by Nancy Fraser. She says, a critical social theory frames its research program and its conceptual framework with an eye to the aims and activities of those in oppositional social movements with which it has a partisan, though not uncritical identification. The questions it asks and the models it designs are informed by that identification and interest. So this is compatible with social theory, that you are coming at it with questions that seem to be normative. Thus, for example, if struggles contesting the subordination of women figured among the most significant of a given age, then a critical social theory for that time would aim, among other things, to shed light on the character and bases of such subordination. It would employ categories and explanatory models which revealed rather than occluded relations of male dominance and female subordination. And it would demystify as ideological rival approaches which obfuscated or rationalized those relations. And she points out, a critical theory makes no claim to any special epistemological status, but rather it supposes that with respect to justification, there's no philosophically interesting difference between a critical theory of society and an uncritical one. So this is to say that once we've moved past social science in terms of just data gathering, which I don't think any social science is, but some people are misled into thinking that. We go into social theory. We are entitled to look at normative questions or be driven by normative questions, and critical theory is an explicit acknowledgement of that and taking up particular ones that are invested in social movements. So here's Eric Olin Wright. He says, emancipatory social science seeks to generate scientific knowledge relevant to the collective project of challenging various forms of human oppression. To call this a form of social science rather than simply social criticism or social philosophy recognizes the importance for this task of systematic scientific knowledge about how the world works. The word emancipatory identifies a central moral purpose in the production of knowledge, the elimination of oppression, and the creation of the conditions for human flourishing. And the word social implies the belief that human emancipation depends on the transformation of the social world, not just the inner life of persons. So emancipatory social science, I think, is very close to what Fraser would call critical social theory. So can social theory do without social ontology, given how I've just described social theory? No, social theory cannot avoid ontology. The whole point is to provide a theory of the social domain that illuminates and explains its structures, processes, and events, and those may be the structures, processes, and events that contribute to oppression, domination, and such. Social theory is an interdisciplinary project that isn't just about collecting data. It interprets and organizes the data systematically, like any theory. And also, like any scientific or philosophical theory, social theory is value-laden. Values play a role in deciding what questions to ask, what phenomena to study, and what explanations are adequate. Emancipatory social science is also political. It centers structures and processes of oppression in order to find leverage points for social change. Okay, so I think social theory cannot be done without also doing social ontology, because that's part of what you're trying to do is figure out what there is and explain what there is and what happens and such like that. So social ontology will be part of the story. But then you could also ask, well, can social ontology do without social theory? So I'm a broadly Quinean in my metaphysics, broadly Quinean pragmatist in metaphysics. And so how do we do this Quinean metaphysics in the context of social theory? How do we determine what there is? We theorize, we just do theory. Theories are answers to questions, and the best answers to our legitimate questions tell us what there is, and our conclusions are fallible. So there is no special process of metaphysical theorizing because we're just trying to answer the questions the best we can. If we want to gain knowledge of the social domain, including the identification and explanation of structures, processes, and events, we should do interdisciplinary social theory. Now, I'm willing to grant that maybe not all social ontology is looking for this sort of knowledge. Sometimes it seems to me that the people who are the early social, well, they're not early, but certain social ontologists who are interested in collective intentionality. They're not really trying to identify or explain structures, processes, and events. They're trying to come up with an account of what it is to take a walk together. Okay, fine. That's not how I think of social theory, and so that's also not how I think of social ontology. But you might want to think of social ontology that way. I'm not going to be a gatekeeper here. Our best theory tells us what there is in the social domain. Our best social theory. So Quine was invested in natural science as the only legitimate form of theorizing, but I think he was mistaken. Social theory is as epistemically sound as natural science, though it's more complicated. And both social and natural theorizing require normative and metaphysical judgments. Okay, so here's the question about descriptive social ontology. So remember Raphael's question is, what is the relationship between descriptive and revisionary social ontology? Well, I'm not sure what is meant in that question by descriptive social ontology. Is that just the folk ontology of the social world, right? You know, what people ordinarily think the social ontology is? If so, then descriptive social ontology risks simply describing local ideology, where I use the term ideology in the pejorative sense as masking power and injustice. I'm not a great believer in folk ontology. I think it has its place when we're trying to understand, what people think about things, but I don't think it has any special claim to being true or adequate or even empirically adequate. Descriptive science, if you think we're talking not about folk ontology, but we're talking about descriptive in the sense of scientific descriptions of the world, it does not aim to refine and organize our everyday beliefs about the world, but to investigate and make discoveries about actual processes and structures. Descriptive sciences are typically revisionary. They challenge our everyday assumptions about what the world is like. Though with enough work, we can make the science consistent with folk psychology. So, that's a whole different project. I don't want to talk too much about, but there's a lot of work about whether the manifest image and the scientific image can be brought together. But the way I'm thinking about it is, if you're just thinking, oh, we're going to just make consistent our everyday assumptions about what the world is like, I think that's a really bad way to do ontology. And it's a super bad way to do social ontology, because our everyday understanding of the world is really corrupt. So revisionary social ontology, at least on one reading, is just our best theory about social ontology, because we're trying to see past our folk understandings. Okay, so can social ontology do without social theory? I asked, can social theory do without social ontology? No. Can social ontology do without social theory? Not on this Quinean kind of approach to ontology. So in the background here, I think, is a kind of pragmatism, not a pragmatism that Quine would necessarily embrace, or not a pragmatism of all that the many, many different pragmatists would all embrace. But here is a one that I find plausible. A good theory will select among the evidentially justified propositions, those that are apt for the purposes of the inquiry, and will organize them to do justice to the issue, posing a legitimate question as suited to the context. Okay, so I want to allow that there are different things that you might fill in where there's the square brackets, and they could be something could talk about at length. But that's the basic formula. I'm not assuming that all evidence is empirical evidence. Mathematics, I think, provides evidence for its claims. And my point here is just to highlight considerations besides the traditional epistemic criteria that need to be taken into account in evaluating a theory. Like, what are the questions we're asking? Why are we asking them? What's going to serve our purposes, et cetera, et cetera. So if you might ask, well, what's pragmatist here? And I think first, theories are responsive to our legitimate interests and need not carve nature at its joints. So an adequate theory, whether it be, I don't think there are joints in nature. I think that that we don't need to spend our time worrying about carving nature at its joints. And also the aptness of our concepts for our purposes, and not just the truth or empirical adequacy of the theory matters. So we need to aim for empirical adequacy, and we aim for truth. But in addition to that, in addition to truth and empirical adequacy, we have to consider the aptness of our concepts for the purposes that we're needing the theory for. Okay, so here I'm going to talk a little bit about practice theory as an example. So over the past decade or so, I've been working within the tradition of practice theory, and Sherry Ortner's paper, Theory in Anthropology since the 60s, I think it is a really nice survey of a lot of social theory, particularly the stuff in anthropology, but beyond that, that she sort of tells a story that brings us to practice theory. And so if you're looking for some of that, and what I'll be saying a little bit more about as we go, but in a very sketchy and outline-ish and outrageous sort of way. So practice theory is framed by a number of different questions, but a central concern is what Charles Tilly calls durable inequality. So the question is, why are oppressive systems so common and persistent? The suggestion that people have discriminatory false beliefs just pushes the question back. Why do so many people have such beliefs and resist updating them in light of evidence to the contrary? One answer, well, that's just the way humans are. It's like so amazing how often people just say, well, yeah, we just don't like people who are different from us. I'm sorry. But not all humans and not all the time have this attitude, and who counts as different and why do they count as different, etc. So I think this is a really bad answer to the question. And so we need to find a better hypothesis. So social systems, looking at social systems is a next step. We might go beyond looking at just our innate tendency to not like the other. Systems are self-maintaining and self-reproducing. So can we make progress by considering the systemic features of societies? Okay, so here's where I'm going to be really fast and quick, and people are going to roll their eyes, but I just wanted to get some of the context out. So people who said, well, let's look at systems as structuralists, but the criticism has been, well, it's too static. There's not enough room for agency. Functionalism, oh, it's too hegemonic. It thinks that everything in society is serving this constant function to keep the society going, and there's not enough room for contestation. Marxism, too reductionist, not enough room for cultural influences. Post-structuralism, too cultural, not enough room for material constraints. So I'm just trying to gesture here at a history of decades of people trying to think about systems and trying to study systems and theorizing systems. And there's a whole range of complaints about them. But from all of that theorizing, it seems that an adequate theory needs to account for the interdependence between agents, material conditions, and culture. So this is something that isn't exactly what Ortner argues, but it's something that I think comes out of this history. So how can an account of practices help? There's us, we're trying to coordinate, and we don't know how. What we have, I want to suggest, is a set of social meanings So the social meanings are public. So you could go back to Geertz for this. I mean, Geertz was saying meanings aren't in the head, right? And you can go back to Putnam for this. Meanings aren't in the head. So there are these social meanings that are public. And then there are resources. So here's a bunny. And the bunny, when it is taken up as something of value, it becomes a resource. And this is a technical term coming out of Giddens. So, excuse me, in this case, we might have the option of interpreting the bunny as a pet, as food, or as a pelt. If we killed it, and we could make a sweater out of it or a scarf out of it. Suppose we take it to be a pet. That is the cultural. So the term I use for these social meanings is a cultural techne, understanding them to be tools. So I want to resist just the notion of talking about culture broadly. Too big a term, too many different contested meanings, etc. So I use the term cultural techne to talk about these social meanings as tools for understanding the world and understanding each other. So, and the cultural techne, when it goes wrong, when it perpetuates subordination, domination, injustice, and such, it becomes ideological. So the cultural techne is the neutral sort of generic word, and ideology is a form of cultural techne. So let's look at pet. So pet is a tool that we can use for interpreting bunny rabbits in the world. And we internalize this set of tools, the schemas, and that produces filtering and shaping mechanisms in our perception of things and our expectations, etc. And once there's been a filtering, then we form attitudes with what gets through the filter, and then we act based on those attitudes, interacting with the bunny. For example, we may breed bunnies to be slow and to be willing to sit on our laps and things like that, because we see them as pets, so that reinforces the social meaning. So there's a looping effect here in the practice. So you interpret it a certain way that enables you to form certain attitudes, you interact with the resource, and that reinforces the social meaning. Okay, it also happens not just with bunnies, but here's a woman. Is she a friend, a mother, or a sex object? And we have a reinforcing practices that constitute individuals as friends, mothers, and sex objects. And likewise for Black men, a friend, a janitor, or a criminal. So, excuse me. So in my view, social practices are patterns of learned behavior that, at least in the primary instances, enable us to coordinate as members of a group in creating, distributing, managing, maintaining, and eliminating a resource due to mutual responsiveness to each other's behavior and the resources in question, as interpreted through the shared meanings or cultural schemas, which is the cultural techne. Okay, so in the process of coordination, so we're going to move past just a single practice to look at how categories are formed and how categories are formed to enable us to coordinate more effectively. So I'm drawing on Kaylin O'Connor's work, The Origins of Unfairness, which I think is a really wonderful use of game theory to go beyond what game theorists usually do. And she points out that some coordination problems, correlative problems, require us all to act in the same way. What side of the street do we drive on, right or the left? But other coordination problems are complementary problems, and they require us to act differently, but in sync. Ballroom dancing, the division of labor, resource distribution. Complementary problems are solved by establishing roles that are suitably related, but we need more than roles. She says there's a function that social categories can play in these cases. In particular, actors can use social categories to identify what sort of role each actor should play in social interaction. So she uses a number of times this example of ballroom dancing. Step forward if you're a woman and step back if you're a man. So you can go into a dance hall and not know anybody there, but if you know the dance steps and you know your gender and you know the gender of the person who invites you to dance, then that's all you need. You can dance together. So there's a kind of fluency that such categories enable to coordinate in dance and other divisions of labor. And she goes on to argue that it's useful to be able to rely on the same categories across tasks. So networks of social relations formed that regularly position individuals in categories, fulfilling stable roles associated with such categories, builds up broad competencies and shapes identities. So what we've got is a set of practices that enables us to use these signals and symbols and meanings to frame our agency in order to respond to the world in certain ways that reinforces the meanings. And then what happens is that those meanings get attached to certain roles so that we're able to use those practices to coordinate effectively and can anticipate in advance what your role is so that you continue to function in that role. So there's a kind of entrenching process here because of the fact that it's very efficient and effective to rely on the same categories across tasks. So here's the issue of durability that we started. So, excuse me, practices. So the question that the practice theory was trying, that the particular question I raised was, why is oppression so durable and ubiquitous? So practices are durable because coordination is necessary for human survival. Culture provides shared signals and meanings that enable us to coordinate in producing, distributing, and organizing things taken to have value. Once coordination is achieved, disrupting it is costly. And practice theory, and I've just sketched my own version of it, there are others, provides a broad framework for answering the question, why are oppressive systems so common and persistent? We're shaped by culture. Answer, we're shaped by culture to participate in practices that distribute things of value and inherit and perpetuate the injustice that came before. However, attention to practices reveals opportunities for social change because practices are a nexus where individual agency is enabled. Because societies are fragmented and practices are in tension with each other, there's a space for contestation and disruption, even if it's difficult to bring about meaningful change. So one thing that's nice about practice theory is that there are all these different practices, right? Practices in a particular department, practices in a neighborhood, practices in a church community, practices, all these different practices in transportation, practices in healthcare. And you don't have, this is why I was talking about how the idea of a techne is better than culture, because culture tends to be kind of homogenizing and become quite hegemonic. But you've got all these different practices, and practices are in tension with each other. So my sister, who was a stay-home mom for a long time, she ended up, after her kids were older, going back to work. And I remember talking to her, and she said, oh my gosh, work is so great because I am valued for what I produce. People thank me, et cetera, et cetera. I've never got that for anything I did at home, right? She lives with 2 sons and a husband, and she's quite a bit older than I am. And she didn't get much recognition for her work at home. And and I get paid and all these wonderful things. And she said, but the downside is I have to have my lunch between 12 and 1. I really miss having the opportunity to just eat lunch when I'm hungry. So she was noticing this kind of, the good things about the work practices, but also the lack of autonomy she had at work that she did have at home. And so these kinds of differences in the fragmentation of our practices, I think that's important for being able to do critique and to begin to contest or disrupt problematic practices. Okay, so recall Raphael's prompts. What is the relation between social ontology and the social sciences? Should social ontology be naturalized? If yes, how should the naturalization be conceived? Are descriptive social ontology and descriptive natural ontology methodologically identical? And I say at least some questions in social ontology should be answered by doing social theory. Social theory is a distinctive branch of interdisciplinary social science, and it's not fundamentally different from other kinds of theory. Another question Raphael asked was, can a social ontology be revisionist? If yes, what is the relation between descriptive and revisionist social ontologies? And I say social theory aims to answer our questions that in ways that go beyond folk theory. Folk theory is often ideological, and critical social theory aims to reveal it as such. Thank you very much.
Great. So let's see, questions? That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Let's see. All right. I think Don Ross has a question first.
Thanks, Sally. That was great. Really enjoyed it. It organized a lot of material very nicely. Glad to see the good plug for Kalen's book, which I agree is a terrific book. Just a point that right at the beginning, you mentioned somebody drew your attention and wanted you to just say social theory instead of social science. Now it seems to me that's the wrong distinction, because I mean that's just really misleading. Those are very, very misleading labels. But let me just for the moment use social theory as a name instead of a description, right? So social theory as the name for that body of literature you talked about at the beginning. I guess it does seem to me important when doing this kind of synoptic survey to at least sort of note that economists are completely outside of all this stuff.
Yeah.
And it's I think a lot of people make the assumption that it's political. I mean, historically, perhaps to some extent it was, but it's not. I mean, we know from doing statistical surveys of economists' political attitudes that most economists are on the left. Not right. I mean, just the majority are that's where they identify. And furthermore, it's also not a topic issue. So, you know, at the AEA last week, I went to a dozen papers, and eight of them weren't about the economy in any standard sense. They were about family dynamics and gender and racial discrimination and all the things that other social scientists talk about. But the underlying body, and of course it's full of theory and there's ontology, but the underlying body of theory is radically different. And I actually think it's also importantly philosophically different, because it doesn't tend to be motivated in the first place by what one might loosely call a kind of social phenomenology. It's largely motivated by some very abstract assumptions about how information flows in systems. Right. And then those abstract models, the economist typically having made an abstract model goes looking around for social phenomena to apply the abstract models to, right, rather than be motivated by any particular critical theory type underlying ontology. There's an interesting project, it seems to me, and people are bound to do it, but we would want people like you to do it in particular, to or people with your background. I mean, we need people who with a solid sense of what's going on in social theory to try and build those bridges. The economists may discover the bridges very, very slowly on their own, but there's no sign of it really.
Yeah. Oh, so thank you for that. And I agree that the person saying, Charles Parsons, who was distinguishing social science and social theory, I think had a kind of more positive sense of what social science was than is tolerable anymore. And so I agree with you that and I think that Eric Olin Wright was trying to, when he was saying, I do emancipatory social science, he was trying to emphasize that science is compatible with a kind of pragmatism that brings our values and our interests and our concerns into the discussion. So yes, on that. On the second points you were talking about economics, I agree. I mean, there are people like Nancy Fulbray and others at UMass Amherst and there Julie Nelson and others who are doing feminist economics. And I think that's more of a bottom up and sort of driven by a critical inquiry. I also think that at MIT, the people in economics that I'm closest to are the people who are in JPAL, which is the Jameel Poverty Action Lab, who are doing empirical economics, as they call it. And I think that there are movements of people who are trying to, in economics, who are trying to connect the economic theory with the on the ground phenomena. And and so I work in a development, D lab, which is a different lab at MIT, where we coordinate somewhat with JPAL people. And I think that that's great stuff. But I agree that a lot of the people who do more theoretical economics in the sense of just, proving theorems, that's kind of
that's not quite what I was alluding to. I mean, I very much put people like the JPAL folks in mind. It seems to me if you look at the JPAL folks, Dufflo and Banerjee and so on, and their vast numbers of followers all over the world now. I mean, it seems to me if you were to do the careful work of unpacking what the underlying ontology of all that RCT work and development is, it's not coming from critical social theory. It's
I agree.
Coming from economics, right? And so, so that's my point. They're studying the phenomena. They're often studying the very same topics. And the body of underlying theory is rich, including ontologically rich, but really different from the background tradition in sociology. And that's where I don't think the bridge building work has been done.
Yes, I agree. And the RCT dominance, I think, is really problematic.
I agree.
Because they don't critically interrogate the notion of preference. So Anderson on Sen and her work and some of the work on the critiques of RCT, I think that is really some of that attempts to build a bridge to say, what about adaptive preferences? How do we really think about a preference? And so some of that, I think is that closer to what you have in mind?
Then there's also, I do lab work and not RCTs, but it's all empirical. And that's another thing again. I mean, we are feuding with the RCT people all the time, and some of our arguments are ontological.
This was very much more sociology, anthropology, but I think you're exactly, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in sort of build bridges with some of the critical bridges with some of the economists. Thank you.
Right. Thanks.
Yep. Okay. I think Jonathan Shaffer is next.
Thanks, Sally. That was awesome as always. I wondered if you fully answered your own question. So you were asking, why are oppressive systems so common and persistent? And I thought, as far as I understood, the answer that you gave from practice theory was that all systems are persistent. But nothing, at least so far, said why oppressive systems are so common. For the answer that you, maybe you could have said, well, this is the sort of answer that you kind of ridiculed at the beginning. Well, that's just the way people are. We set up oppressive systems. Maybe there's some truth to that, but is there a further part of the story to answer the other aspect of your question as to why we get so many oppressive systems?
Yeah, so that's part of what Kaylin's book talks about. I mean, what she suggests is as soon as you develop a division of labor, then you have unequal bargaining power in the division of labor. And once you have unequal bargaining power, some people are going to have more power than other people. And that's going to very quickly push you into hierarchical systems that are typically oppressive. And it's a very, what she's trying to say is not that it has to happen, but it takes very little for it to happen. And so I didn't get into that here, but I think that is part of the story. And then what happens is that, well, we got a way to coordinate, and coordination is better than non-coordination. And another thing is, I think that sometimes it just is an accident of multiple frames coming together, or societies interacting, or things like this, that there's difference in resources between two groups of people, right? And they come together and they have to interact with each other. There's going to be one has more bargaining power than the other. So sometimes it's this very minimal sort of game theoretic assumptions about division of labor. If you think division of labor is necessary, which I do think it is, then you can get it very easily. But sometimes it's overdetermined because of the ways in which resources are not equally distributed in the world.
Thank you.
Okay. So looks like Frank is next in the list.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious about why you reject folk ontology to a fairly large extent. I'm not questioning it, actually. I think there are good reasons to, but I'm just wondering how you would justify it. So imagine someone would defend folk ontology by saying, well, you know, these are all the ordinary categories and concepts and schemas that we live by. They feature in our attitudes and we act on those attitudes. So it can hardly be not the case that the roles that we conceive of, for instance, are not the ones as we conceive of them. And so a student is a student, a professor is a professor, because of the schemas that we rely on. But how would you challenge that?
Well, I think that most folk social ontology is individualistic. It thinks that we are individuals with our preferences and desires, et cetera, like that, sort of pre-social. And we come into a situation and we have to coordinate with other people. And so we make bargains with them and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's very difficult to get people to see structures, just to sort of see systems, to see how they're a part of a system. And so I think that the folk social ontology is actually that kind of individualism is highly ideological, and it blames people for, you know, it's in the same with ethics. You know, a lot of ethics is very ideological because it's so individualistic and it's focusing on the individual's actions as bad or blameworthy or lacking moral worth and all this kind of stuff, when really that individual has been shaped so much by the structures and whatever, and we really need to be looking at the structures that are shaping us to be and do what we do in order to understand how the social world works. So yeah, if you're interested in what is it to be a student and want to analyze what it is to be a student or what it is to be a professor, and sort of just do, you know, kind of ordinary old-fashioned conceptual analysis on that, sure, you know, you can do that, but I think that just misses most of the important features of the social domain.
If I can briefly follow up, so I would think that some of the ideas that we have about, for instance, professor-student relationships feed into our actions and kind of make themselves true. Whereas others are probably beneath the surface or are just slightly different from how we conceive of them, and the causal relations cannot, have to be empirically investigated. Do you allow for that, or do you think it's all empirical?
Yeah, no, I do think that you know, student-teacher relationships are, you know, so I think it really depends on the context. So I think that there's hierarchy in student-teacher relationships, some of which is warranted and some of which is not warranted. And the ways in which systems give power to faculty over aspects of student lives, you know, or the ways in which they is problematic. And so it's hidden, it's masked. like in institutions, like my institution, is really corrupt. I mean, grotesquely corrupt. But most of the people and the way it works and how it functions, but most of the people, they're just trying to get through their days and finish their problem sets and prepare their lectures. And they don't really even think of MIT as a system, and a system that's embedded in these other capitalist systems and, et cetera, like that. So the systemic, the ways in which these particular relations are embedded in these broader systems, I think is really obscured in everyday folk understandings. And it might be that they're just under the surface and you just have to dig a bit. Maybe that's it. But my experience is no, you really need to get a theory of capitalism and exploitation and, and sort of the role of science and society and engineering and all of that to have a good understanding of my relationship, even with my students.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, that helps.
Oh, okay, it looks like, is it Oliver? Olivier?
Olivier.
Sorry.
Thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Sally, for the nice talk. I was wondering about the dependency you claim between social ontology and critical theory. It seems to me we can have rational disagreement about whether or not we are living in an oppressive system, which is not really apparent, somehow hidden to us. But some people think it's not at all the case. Some people think it's a bit the case, but that you are exaggerating if you think that the system is basically oppressive. So those debates between, let's say, Marxist, libertarian, conservative, I mean, all different kinds of political ideology, it seems to me they occur at the level of social ontology here. I mean, if we disagree about whether or not we live in an oppressive system, we disagree about the social ontology. But given the way you have drawn the picture, it seems to me that if, say, I'm a conservative and disagree that we live in an oppressive system, you are going to tell me that I'm not making social ontology, because social ontology depends on critical theory and that I reject critical theory. So you see, I would like social ontology to be more politically neutral, to be one place in which political disagreement can unfold, but you seem to put it in one political side, making it a bit less interesting. Yeah.
So I guess what I think is that, the conservatives and the libertarians and the Marxists are asking different questions, and so they're looking at different aspects of the reality. This is where the pragmatism comes in. And so it might be that, so I've been thinking about the mask wearing in the United States and the libertarians versus the public health people. And the libertarians, all they care about is individual liberty. And they don't see the ways in which their individual liberty infringes on the liberty of others, because they're just worried about their own individual liberty. So there is an ontology there that they're committed to, that they see by virtue of their cultural techne, their ideology of what is important and what is valuable and such like that. That's what they see. But there's other things that they don't see. They don't see the effects of not wearing masks on public health or the ways in which it infringes on others' liberty. So libertarians are supposed to be committed to the maximum amount of liberty for all, but they are missing the fact that they're not wearing masks is making people stay at home and try and stay away from them. And so they're infringing on the liberty of others, but they don't see that. And so, but also the liberals will sometimes look just at, the kind of effects on all without understanding the significance of the liberty of an individual to make their own decisions about vaccines or whatever like that. So my view about this would be that there are ideologies that so any particular cultural techne is going to limit the information that we pick up from the world because we cannot get it all. It is too much. We can't process it. It is, and we all have to focus, and we naturally focus on things that matter to us we learn what ought to matter to us through our social context, right? We learn what ought to matter, and so we focus on that. But what we do need to do is learn how to look at things that other people care about and try to figure out what are the good things to care about. And so I would say that the world is neutral, but the cultural technes are not neutral. And so when we're trying to argue, part of what we have to do is say, excuse me, but you're ignorant about this, and of me too, right? I've had to have this happen to me all the time. My lens that I use for understanding the world is really gappy and distorted and, whatever. And so part of what we do in discourse is say, sorry, the frame that you're bringing to this is not allowing you to see and care about these other issues. So to think of it this way, the world is just this incredibly complex, sort of difficult, messy reality. Culture gives us tools for paying attention to certain things and not others, because also, among other things, it gives us ways of caring and people to care about, all that kind of stuff. And so what we're trying to do is, yes, have rational debate, but rational debate sometimes includes giving other people new experiences. And so what I think is that if you're stuck in rational debate, where you're just arguing back and forth, you're not going to make progress. Because what you need to do is open experience, change the concepts, change your frame, do a paradigm shift, because that is how we make moral progress. Okay, Don is officially next, but he's already had one question. So Don, Francesco hasn't, so I'll let Francesco go next, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, I have a comment about this, the last answer that Sally gave to Olivier. I mean, it seems that here we're back to the issue of, folk ontology versus sort of philosophical ontologies. And I mean, many of the things that you've just said are correct, maybe, of, the views of the average cowboy from Texas. But, if you read, sophisticated philosophers, I don't know, if you read Hayek, I mean, of course, he was totally aware of all the things that you just said that libertarians are not aware, partly because he was a social democrat at one time. The point is that he simply thought, as a value judgment, that some things are more important than others. And he argued, that liberty is more important than, all the other bad
public health.
Right. So I don't
liberty
think
more important than public health. Okay, got it.
Yeah, it's really not a matter of, not seeing. It's really a matter of judging and valuing things differently.
Well, I think my own view is that, I'm a kind of Brantian about this. I think a lot of moral disagreements are not fundamental. I think a lot of them are based on empirical disagreements or quasi-empirical disagreements. And there are very few fundamental disagreements. And so if we get to those fundamental disagreements, I think there too, rational debate is not going to help us, right? That because they're foundational, they're hinge propositions that are, and so what you're going to need is a paradigm shift. Okay, and how we're going to do that? I mean, we may not be able to get to a society where we all agree on our fundamental moral judgments, but that's why we have democracy, right? Because democracy tolerates disagreement at that level, right? So I guess my view is first that this is controversial, but most moral disagreement is not fundamental. There are some fundamental disagreements. Rational discussion and debate is not going to get us past that because they're more fundamental than most of our other beliefs. And so we're not going to change them based on someone else's argument. We can change them sometimes by new experiences or by cultural pressures. So think about George Wallace and his commitment to segregation now, segregation forever, right? So that was his deep value about that. But sorry, history overtook him. And eventually he had to just conform, he had to do it. So I think democracy can provide us with collective solutions to fundamental moral disagreements, but it's not pretty.
Okay, I think we still have time to get to Don's question. So, Don?
So it was a finger rather than a cube. So because I wanted to just say something, a comment on Olivier's question and Sally's answer, because it seems to me, Sally, your answer encoded something that would have been, without you saying, something that would have been a slightly more direct response to Olivier, right? Which is, so, but maybe you'll disagree with this. So I don't want to, put words in your mouth. But it seems to me you could have said, read the emancipatory part in critical theory, not as just necessarily or directly first order referring to emancipation of oppressed groups from oppressed systems as normally framed by the left, even if that's how things often play out for all sorts of reasons we understand. The first order reference of emancipatory here is emancipation precisely from these closed frames that tend to characterize political ideologies, right? So, and that's also why it seems to me Francesco's point is also right. I mean, I doubt very much that Hayek, if he were alive today, would be in favor of these yahoos who refuse. He would have put his mask on, right? Right, because that's idiot libertarianism. And it's not even understanding that, as you said, they're not even understanding the implications of their own ideology, which is not selfishness, right? Liberty, Mill recognizes the point. So, but I guess the thing is, if one says emancipatory here means in the first place, emancipatory from ontological blind spots.
Yeah.
And then you can,
I like that.
I mean, Solzhenitsyn was oppressed. Solzhenitsyn and people like that were oppressed by the Soviet Union, and emancipatory in that case would have had the opposite ideological political spin. And it was equally an emancipatory project. They were.
Yeah, so this is more in keeping with what I interpret as the more traditional German critical theory approach, is that you don't try to take a stand on the first order moral and political commitments, but you emancipate people from their ideological blockages and you free them to have better epistemic practices. So I'm thinking of Tito Stoll and Robin Salakates and Rahel Yegi, and they're they like to stay at the second order emancipation. And I've gone more with the Nancy Fraser sort of view about this, and in response to Hannah, there's a book called Debating Critical Theory, which was a feshra for Hannah, and where I resist the certain of the arguments that they make for staying second order, because as Nancy says, it is okay to be embedded in a social movement, not uncritically embedded, but embedded in a social movement, and to try and reveal the knowledge, the standpoint, of and the ignorance of others. And so I think both are important. So for example, in the context of standpoint epistemology, white people are really, really ignorant about the lives of Black people and about the experiences of Black people and about the history of Black, African Americans, because of the ideology of American education and such like that. So part of what a standpoint theorist can do as a critical theorist is draw on the truth about our history and draw on the truth about these other sorts of things and point to the oppressive structures that have been problematic. And the same is true of feminism, of course. So I think both are needed, and maybe in different contexts. So maybe the libertarian liberal, there it's going to be, more second order. But in the case of racial oppression, I think the facts.
But you can't. I guess you can sort of derive the other thing from the first order thing, right? Basically the second order thing follows from the first order thing plus a bunch of facts.
Yeah. I
And
got
you
you.
just automatically slide straight into the second order thing because the facts
Got
are
it.
what they are.
Yeah, got it. Thank you.
Okay, Raphael, looks like there are no more questions and we're a little bit past ending time. So should we call it a day or?
Yeah, we can call it a day. It was quite a day, and thank you so much, Steve, for this really incredible talk. I really loved it.
Oh, thank you. Well, as I said, I thought it was a little bit superficial because I'm just going, I'm Aquanian. What is this?
It was
Hey.
a marvelous talk. It was really marvelous.
Thank you. Thank you. All
Okay.
right. Well, I appreciate it. And thanks again for organizing, and thanks for people for listening and asking questions. I learned it was really helpful to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay,
Everyone,
cheers.
so see you tomorrow. Bye. Good evening or good afternoon. I don't know. See you tomorrow. Bye.